Imagine waking up next year and discovering that some of the world's most important food commodities have suddenly become much more expensive. Coffee, rice, wheat, sugar, soybeans. This might sound like another inflation scare, but something potentially much bigger is happening. The world is heading into what is being described as a potentially record strength El Niño. And El Niño is already threatening agricultural production across some of the world's most important growing regions. But here's the part that makes this story particularly concerning. This is not just a weather story. At the same time, shipping through critical trade routes is being disrupted. Fertilizer costs are rising. Governments are becoming more willing to restrict exports and protect domestic food supplies. And some of the world's most important agricultural exporters are facing production problems simultaneously. One assessment puts the potential increase in global food commodity prices at 10 to 18% by June next year. And if that happens, the consequences won't stop at the supermarket. It could affect inflation, interest rates, consumer spending, government policy, even political stability, increased migration. So today, I want to explain why the next food shock may already be forming, and why El Niño may only be the beginning. So let's start with El Niño. El Niño is a recurring climate pattern that changes temperatures and rainfall across large parts of the world. And the important thing for food markets is that it doesn't affect every agricultural region the same way. Some areas become much drier, others become wetter, some crops benefit, others suffer. And when this happens across several major agricultural producing regions at the same time, global commodity markets can become extremely sensitive to relatively small changes in production. The three regions that matter particularly closely here are Latin America, the Asia Pacific, and Africa. They aren't just geographically exposed to the weather pattern. They also contain some of the world's most important exporters of agricultural commodities. And that combination is what makes this potentially dangerous. Take Brazil. Brazil is one of the world's agricultural superpowers, but the impact of El Niño isn't going to be uniform across the country. Northern states including Maranhão, Tocantins, and Bahia are facing drought risks. In the central heartlands of Mato Grosso and Goiás, uneven rainfall and heat stress could disrupt planting and affect crops including soybeans and corn. But southern Brazil could actually benefit from higher rainfall. During the previous major El Niño during 2023, soybean yields in Rio Grande do Sul increased by about 12%. So this isn't simply a story of El Niño equals lower Brazilian production. It's much more complicated. And that's important because global commodity markets don't just respond to whether production goes up or down. They respond to where production changes, what commodities affected, and whether the lost supply cannot be replaced from somewhere else. And in some cases, it just can't. So let's go to the second chapter, which is a hidden problem, and this brings us to what I think is the most important part of the story, fertilizer. Because there is a direct connection between energy markets and the food markets. Farmers need fertilizer to maximize yields, and fertilizer production is heavily dependent on energy. So when energy and shipping costs rise, fertilizer costs can rise as well. And when fertilizers become more expensive, farmers may reduce how much they apply. This can eventually reduce crop yields. So you get a chain reaction. Let's take the geopolitical disruption in the Middle East. This has led to high energy and fertilizer costs, which is lower fertilizer application, which is lower potential crop yields, which means tighter food markets, which ultimately means higher food prices. This basically highlights the risk that higher costs associated with the Strait of Hormuz disruption could reduce fertilizer applications in Brazil, Colombia, and Guyana. And that is what makes this different from a conventional weather shock. Normally, you might think a drought damages a crop, prices rise, then the next harvest restores supply. But what happens if the farmer is simultaneously facing higher fertilizer costs, tighter credit, and lower soil moisture? The supply response becomes much harder. Brazil is already facing high producer debt and restricted credit conditions, making higher fertilizer costs an additional headwind. And this isn't limited just to Brazil. Colombia is facing lower rainfall. The Central American dry corridor is particularly vulnerable, affecting crops including corn, beans, and coffee. So the food story is already becoming intertwined with energy and geopolitical story. Now let's move to where the real pressure builds, and that is Asia, because this is where the scale of the potential problem becomes much more significant. India, Indonesia, and Malaysia have something very important on their side: inventories and government intervention. These buffers can cushion production losses, but they don't eliminate the underlying problem. The assessment estimates that rice production across the region could fall by 2 to 8% compared with average years. India is particularly important. The country has substantial rice stockpiles, nearly 3 times its government buffer requirements. So India has some protection against a poor harvest. But there's another side to this. Governments don't always behave like normal commodity traders. If domestic food prices rise, governments then decide that protecting their own population is more important than exports. And that is already happening. India has banned sugar exports since May because of concerns about production. The sugar price index subsequently rose 5.6% in July, reflecting expectations of weaker production across Asia. This creates one of the most important feedback loops in global food markets. A country tries to protect itself and accidentally makes the global market tighter. We'll come to that. But first, there's another major agricultural exporter that deserves attention in the region, and that is Australia, and specifically the wheat problem. Australia is expected to face significant pressure on wheat production as El Niño-driven drought affects growing conditions. And this matters because Australia is the world's third largest wheat exporter. Australian wheat exports fell by about 30% already this season. Now that's an important distinction. India is the world's second largest wheat producer, but India accounts for only 1 to 2% of global wheat exports. Australia produces less wheat than India, but it is much more important to the international market because a much larger proportion of its production is exported. And that tells you something very important about food security. Production is not everything. What matters to the global market is exportable supply. A country can have huge domestic production and still have relatively little influence over international prices. But if one of the world's major exporters suffers a major production decline, the impact can be felt globally. Now let's look at two commodities that consumers are particularly familiar with: palm oil and coffee. Indonesia and Malaysia together account for around 85% of global palm oil production, and any drought could reduce palm fruit yields as El Niño intensifies. But here's something particularly interesting. The impact may not become fully visible immediately. Because palm oil is harvested continuously, the production decline could become clearer 6 to 8 months after El Niño peaks. So there could be a significant lag between the weather event and the full commodity market impact. And Indonesia has another factor working in the same direction. Its B50 biodiesel program increases domestic demand for palm oil. That means less supply for export. Vegetable oil prices are already reported to be 23% higher than a year earlier. And then there's coffee. Vietnam and Indonesia account for more than 40% of global Robusta coffee exports, and both are highly sensitive to El Niño conditions. The expectation is that their Robusta harvest could weaken in the spring of 2027. So when you're sitting in a coffee shop next year and wondering why your coffee is more expensive, the explanation may have little to do with the coffee shop itself. It could start thousands of kilometers away with weather in Southeast Asia. And let's go then to Africa, where food security is the issue. This is where the story becomes more serious than simply commodity prices. West Africa produces more than 60% of the world's cocoa. The production is already under pressure. In Côte d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast, stunted pod development is reportedly reducing harvests by much as 20%. Ghana's regulators are warned of a production decline of at least 16%. Higher rainfall and humidity can also increase the risk of disease and pests. And fertilizer shortages linked to the broader geopolitical situation are creating another problem for farmers. So once again, we have the same combination: weather plus fertilizer plus geopolitics plus concentrated supply. And then there is Southern Africa. Drought threatens grain production. The region has an important cushion because grain inventories are relatively strong following 2 wet La Niña seasons. But higher fertilizer costs, combined with low soil moisture, could still significantly reduce production. And this is where the consequences stop being purely financial. Lower grain production can translate into food insecurity and hunger. Humanitarian agencies are already preparing resources for high-risk countries. Mozambique and Ethiopia are particularly notable concerns in the assessment. This is why the food story is not simply about the price of wheat or coffee. For some countries, it's about whether there is enough food available at all. And the government response could make things much worse. Governments can actually make the situation better. They can release strategic inventories, they can activate drought preparedness programs, they can subsidize imports, they can support farmers. These measures can cushion the impact of a production shock. And the assessment specifically notes that government stockpiles and preparedness measures should provide some protection. But there's a paradox. Government intervention can also make the global market tighter. Imagine you are the government of a major agricultural exporter. Your farmers have had a bad harvest. Food prices are rising. Your population is getting angry. You have 2 choices. You can continue exporting, or you can restrict exports and preserve more food for your domestic population. Politically, the second option can be very attractive, but imagine several major exporters making the same decision. Suddenly, global export availability falls, and that creates a vicious cycle. So there's poor harvest, there's higher prices, government intervention, export restrictions, less global supply, and even more higher prices. This is one of the reasons food crises can accelerate so quickly. And this is not really just an El Niño story. It would be very easy to describe all this as El Niño is very bad for agricultural commodities. I think that misses the bigger picture. The real risk is the interaction of several different shocks. Think about what is happening. We have El Niño creating drought, heat, and excessive rainfall in some areas. We have shipping disruptions affecting the movement and cost of commodities and agricultural inputs. We have higher fertilizer costs as a result of the Middle East issues. We have concentrated global production. We have government intervention. We've got geopolitical conflict. Individually, each problem might be manageable, but when they all happen at the same time, the system becomes much more fragile. And this is why the potential 10 to 18% increase in global food prices by June next year is worth paying attention to. I'm not suggesting that food prices will mechanically rise by exactly the 10 to 18%. Commodity markets don't work like that. The weather can change, farmers can respond, governments can intervene, alternative supplies can emerge. But this illustrates the potential scale of the risk, and that's what matters. So what should we watch for? I'd focus on four things. The first is the weather, particularly Brazil, Southeast Asia, Australia, and West Africa. Second, fertilizer prices and availability, because fertilizers could become the bridge between the energy crisis and the food crisis. Third, watch for government policy. Watch for export restrictions, strategic stockpiling, and domestic price interventions. And finally, the fourth point, I would watch for inventories, because inventories determine how long the global market can absorb production losses before prices begin to move violently. These four indicators could tell us whether this remains a manageable agricultural shock or develops into something much larger. So what's the conclusion of this? This is a perfect storm, and this is ultimately why I think the next food crisis could look very different from the last one. It may not arrive as one dramatic event. There may be no single day when everyone suddenly realizes that there's a global food shortage. Instead, it could build quietly. A drought here, a poor harvest there, fertilizers becoming more expensive, a country restricting exports, another country starts stockpiling, shipping costs rise, harvest disappoint, and eventually the market discovers that there isn't enough flexibility left. The biggest risk isn't one failed harvest. It's several manageable problems arriving at the same time. And if that happens, the consequences won't stop at agricultural commodities. This will feed to food inflation, interest rates, consumer spending, migration, government policy, and potentially even political stability. The world has spent years worrying about energy security, but perhaps we should start asking another question. What happens when food security becomes the next major global constraint? Because the next food shock may not be caused by El Niño alone. It could be caused by the interaction of weather, energy, shipping, and geopolitics. And if those forces continue moving in the same direction, the food markets of 2027 could look very different from those of today. If you want to understand how energy, commodities, and geopolitics interact before they show up in the headlines, subscribe. That's exactly what we're going to be tracking over here. Thank you.